Hello, Janeites, and welcome to Austen Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Jane Austen Society of North America. I'm your host, Brecken Wood, from the Georgia region of JASNA. Dear listeners, this episode marks our 3-year anniversary. If you've been with us from the beginning, thank you so much for your support. If this is the first time you're tuning in, welcome. After hosting 35 episodes, I'm taking the summer off, but the podcast isn't. We have several special episodes and guest hosts lined up to keep the Austen conversation flowing, and I'll be back in the fall. This month we have a birthday treat for you. We're sharing Jane Austen, Material Girl, a lively conversation between Paula Byrne and Hilary Davidson that was recorded at JASNA's 2025 Annual General Meeting in Baltimore. Paula Byrne is a best-selling biographer, literary critic, and novelist. She is the author of The Real Jane Austen, A Life in Small Things, which explores her life through the objects around her, The Genius of Jane Austen, her love of theater and why she is a hit in Hollywood, and the novel 6 Weeks by the Sea, which blends fact and fiction to imagine Austen's visit to the seaside in 1801. As an Austen expert, she has also frequently appeared on television, broadcast on radio, and consulted on period dramas. Beyond her Austen scholarship, Paula has written best-selling biographies about Dido Elizabeth Belle, Mary Robinson, Barbara Pym, Kathleen Kennedy, Evelyn Waugh, and Thomas Hardy. Hilary Davidson is a dress, textile, and fashion historian and curator and chair and associate professor in the School of Graduate Studies at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. She has curated exhibitions, lectured widely, and published extensively. Her books include Dress in the Age of Jane Austen, Regency Fashion, Jane Austen's Wardrobe, and A Guide to Regency Dress. Enjoy the episode.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Paula for doing this with me and for the fantastic title of our talk, conversation, that we were talking about what we want to talk about and what we have a shared interest in Austen. And it is about materiality and things. And Paula just went, Jane Austen, Material Girl, with her usual aplomb. And I think that's such a great way to sort of summarize what we share in our love of Austen. And in fact, we are friends because of our shared love of...
Why don't we tell that story? Should we tell the story of how we met?
Yeah, okay. The full story or the... Yeah, okay. All right, so
Jane Austen brought us together. So
Jane Austen brought us together.
As many people here have been brought together through a love of Jane Austen, the reason we're friends is because of Jane Austen.
So I think it was 2010, which is, oh my God, 15 years ago. And I was a curator of fashion and decorative arts at the Museum of London. And a television company came to the museum to ask if they could film some Regency dress from the costume collection as part of something they were doing about identifying an early 19th century portrait. So that was all the information I got. It came to me as the dress curator, and I get lots of requests for this. So I worked on it. I had meetings, and they knew nothing about my work on Jane Austen's Pelisse, which I'd already engaged with by that time. And so by the time they finally actually sort of said, all right, so this is the portrait that we're going to be to be looking at, and they showed it to me, I just went, oh, look, it's Jane Austen. And they went, why did you say that? And I went, oh, I've been working on what Austen looks like, and you know, it's got Francis's nose, and they went, well, that's actually what we're looking at, trying to see if we can identify this portrait that belongs to Paula Byrne. And one day in the costume store at the Museum of London, Paula Byrne and Catherine Sutherland came in, and we worked together on that documentary about your portrait
great.
And trying to see whether it was Jane Austen. And that's what this thing, and looking at the details of her dress and trying to sort of analyze this portrait in terms of how would this have related to fabrics and cut and time of day.
And you were just so brilliant because Hilary, because she makes dresses and shoes, as well as being a fashion historian, has such a deep understanding of fabric. And I always wanted her for the programme. So she didn't know what I knew. So it was just the BBC saying, hey, do you want to just do this? And she was so amazing because when we went into the museum, she had 3 beautiful dresses and she could date them exactly by the sleeve, by the cut. Even the way, I couldn't believe it because my portrait had this sort of, what Catherine Sutherland says, you know, the bomb and the bonnet, because the bomb sort of sticks out because of the fabric. And so Hilary said, look, this is what happens in 1814 to dress. And she demonstrated how the fabric sort of billows out to give this silhouette. And she was just fantastic. But it was all a bit formal, so we weren't really friends. And then many years later, she came to Oxford and she's like, do you want to meet? And I'm like, yes, you were on the programme. And we've been great friends since then.
Exactly.
So we thought it'd be fun to do a talk about Jane Austen as Material Girl. So why don't you start with some clothes and then we can take it from there.
So that's what I came to Regency dress through Jane Austen. The reason I've now written 3 books, much to my surprise, I tell you, about Regency dress is because of Jane Austen and because of working on this pelisse and kind of starting with the figure of her and trying to see if there's another way into Austen through this garment. Could I prove the provenance? Could I look at what is held in this garment, the material qualities, and see if that could tell us about how that might belong to Austen. So for me, she's the seed of all Regency dress. And from then she became the lens that I look at Regency dress through. And when I came to my second book, Jane Austen's Wardrobe, again, I was looking for those small details, those kind of tiny elements, those traces at which we've heard so in so many talks this weekend of, the tiny magnitude of her genius. And I was interested in those small details that she gives us, or that might be gestures in the world around her that are alternative ways into this person that people want to know so much about. And I feel like your Life in Small Things was doing something similar.
Oh, definitely. And I love that quote about the sponge cake, that, she's even interested in a sponge cake, because I think someone with such a capacious mind and imagination is interested in stuff. And I really like stuff, and I love fashion. And I never think it's frivolous. I think women feel very empowered when they wear the right dress. And I love the fact that Jane Austen she is obviously my favourite author and she's serious, but she does little drawings of her cloak and lace. And she's so interested in fashion and she's so interested in headbands. And that's the sort of thing I really love, because it really brings her alive for me. But we were talking a bit, in preparation for this talk, about the things that I think I mentioned this in my talk, that there are objects that I couldn't include because I only had so many chapters. And people have said, again, what are the things you didn't include? And I really like the toothpick in Sense and Sensibility.
Mr. Ferrers'
which
toothpick.
Which is a Robert Ferrers toothpick. And, I'm always beating myself up with things that I didn't do as opposed to the things that I did do. I'm always like, why did I leave that out? But I think Jane Austen, the physicality of these things, and I think small things particularly really interest me. And I just love that moment when Eleanor is pawning her mother's jewels, isn't she? And she goes into that jewellery shop, do you remember? And Robert Ferrers is picking a toothpick. And he spends 15 minutes picking, or is it John? Who is it? Which one is it? Which brother is it? John Mullen. You'll know.
Yeah.
It's Robert. I'm right. It is Robert. It's a Robert, or is it a case? I knew John would know, but I just remember it takes him 15 minutes, and then there's just a moment when the authorial voice says, he wouldn't really choose earrings. John wouldn't have chosen earrings for his sisters, and earrings, toothpicks, small things. But somehow they take on this sort of incredible magnitude about sort of meanness. And we think of Mrs. Ferrers in that amazing chapter when she disinherits her sister-in-laws and ends up saying, well, we'll just send a few pheasants, Jane Austen's just very attuned to material things. And these girls have nothing. And they really are relying on the kindness of strangers. But somehow the toothpick, I thought, I could have written a whole book on that toothpick. But it sort of escaped me.
But it's that, I think that...
Or toothpick case.
It's what... I think what's so fascinating about Things and Austen is she's living in a time of increasing material production and therefore consumption, but things have greater meaning. There's fewer of them, they're harder to get, they're better made, they last longer, they have more value in them, and people are more cautious and careful about them, and how things accrue to you, how you take care of them, how you might give them to others. And so things are really, really important, especially in the kind of domestic, more female world of Austen. Things have greater significance, and to kind of pay attention to the qualities of those materials and those things is to kind of also to help understand the world as Austen was experiencing it, and as her characters do, and as her wider family do. It's a kind of an attention that we lose to a certain extent by the sheer vast gluts of stuff that we have around us all the time and can throw away and not have to think about recycling. So that just the meaning of things for Regency society is much, much more important.
Well, I was also interested in things coming back across the ocean. So I think I was talking to somebody tonight about Philadelphia, who was Jane Austen's aunt. And also, why is she called Philadelphia? I mean, it's so extraordinary. And this is a girl who worked in a milliner's. And so this is Jane Austen's father's sister. And there was another one, Leonora, who we sort of really lose Leonora. But Philadelphia, I say recently, but recently-ish, discovered worked in a milliner's in Covent Garden, which was Hilary will well know, was a really horrible life. And people didn't live very long. It was just backbreaking, underpaid work. And so Philadelphia went off to find herself a husband on the fishing fleet, which was the name of the ship that took you to the East Indies to find a husband. When she's sort of 16 or 17, or even younger, I can't remember. I know she meets Clive of India's wife on the boat and they become firm friends. And you think, my goodness, can you imagine what that's like? Being that young girl, hoping you might find a nice rich doctor. And she did. So well done, Philadelphia. But I was always really interested in the stuff that comes back and forth. And when I remember reading Jane Austen's Juvenilia and thinking, why is she mentioning mangoes and curry sauce and Indian shawls in her Juvenilia? And she writes a short story about a girl like Philadelphia who goes off to find a husband in Bengal. And you think, but that's because her aunt's sending stuff. And then the Austens are sending stuff back, like embroidered waistcoats and books. And it's stuff again, like stuff's going back and forth. And pipes of Madeira are being sent from Bengal. And I just that really brought Jane Austen's world alive, but in a kind of global way of stuff coming back and forth.
Well, in the European settlement in Australia, settlement invasion, it happens in 1788, and by the time the free settlers are coming out, people shop from the colony of New South Wales back in Britain. They send lists back saying, can you go to my shoemaker and get 3 pairs of this, and I want this ribbons from this retailer, and actually I need, this much muslin. And they're shopping at a distance exactly the same way they would in London. So the person who's shopping next to, Jane or Cassandra Austen when they're doing theirs, it might be going out to the other side of the world, but it's kind of Britishness through things, but those connections are allowing this stuff to move out that they think are important enough to take with them in their new life. They have meaning for them, and the access to things. The colony of New South Wales is also trading directly with India. They're getting lots of those fabulous goods directly out there, and that world of consumer goods that's really starting to sort of open up, that the Austens were so much a part of, especially with Frank and Charles in the Navy, because one of the great things about the Navy is the privilege, which is your tax-free import allowance. So when Lady Bertram she's very pleased about William Price's position as a midshipman on a merchantman, because she can have an Indian shawl. I think I'll have two shawls, Fanny. And because William can bring them back in tax-free. That's what she's concerned about, the duty-free shopping. And it's these kind of like personal connections about things, and the wonderful, you've got a chapter on shawls in the life of small things, and what the shawl does, especially as a kind of an item that was made traditionally in Kashmir for men, and then becomes this hugely popular European item that's imitated by European manufacturers. There's a whole history of the world in just this one object.
And spices. When I was doing research for my novel, I was consulting Martha Lloyd's household book, which some of you will know, won't you? Do you know the household book? Oh, isn't it just the best sauce? Like, they made cold cream for their faces. I'm like, I want to make that, like, today.
I've done that.
Like, have you done that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, and you sort of flip it, you get all the cookery stuff, and then you flip it and you get, how you have a rash and has a cold cream, or it can be a cold cream for your face. But I was really intrigued that there were recipes for Frank's favourite curry. So they're getting the spices, they're getting stuff brought over, and Martha Lloyd's making... So I had this moment when Frank says, can you make me one of your curries? And we all know he married her eventually when she's like 70. So I think they might have fallen in love over curry. Curry sauce. But I find that just endlessly... I think I really like the quotidian. I really like utterly mundane, ordinary stuff. And that's why I love Jane Austen saying, even a sponge cake, I want to know all the details of it, because I just love the quotidian. Because I think ordinary is never ordinary. Ordinary always seems to me very extraordinary. That's probably why I like Barbara Pym as well. She'll make a whole story about a string bag and what people put in a string bag, because you can see it. And so I just like the ordinary. And I just love that book, because you get to know, Martha, what are wigs? I made wigs the other day. I made Martha Lloyd's wigs. They're just like buns. I just love it. I'm just like, this is just brilliant stuff, syllabubs and all this stuff. And because you've got to have access, especially the spices.
And it's also like the ordinary tells you what people take for granted. Both you and I have lived in different countries, and I'm totally fascinated by grocery stores. Right. So, American grocery stores, I go in like an anthropologist, like, oh, you do this and you do this, and you can't get lemonade here. Like, not like we understand lemonade. And like, you can get this and you can't get that. And it's just fascinating, because it tells you what the conventions are, what people do, what they value. And so to sort of do that in the past, it brings out all of these things that, a Regency person, I think would be like, why are you interested in a spice cabinet or whatever it is? But it tells you what their normal is. What do they assume about being human in the world in a certain way?
I think Jane Austen uses objects, just as I said, with the toothpick. She doesn't really waste anything. And I think if she thinks it's important, it's probably important.
Yeah.
So I really like that moment in Sense and Sensibility when Eleanor is having a bit of a face-off with Lucy. And, Eleanor's slightly trying to find out, how much she knows about her man. And she knows, because Lucy's begun to tell her that she's secretly engaged to Edward Ferrars. But they're kind of having this duel over a filigree basket. And I'm like, why a filigree basket? What is going on there with the filigree basket?
The one that Lucy doesn't finish, or
they're doing it for
passive aggressive.
The horrible little spoiled child, Anne-Marie. We all remember Anne-Marie, don't we? Because she's she's such a monster, Lady Middleton's child. She's just. I think Jane Austen is utterly brilliant on children. I think she really understands and gets children. I still think the funniest moment is two funny moments when. Who's the little boy who has the fight with Mrs. Bennet about, when I'm older, I'm going to drink alcohol? And she says, no, you're not. And he says, yes, I am. And she says, no, you're not. And she has this, like, row with a 5-year-old. And it's just, like, hilarious. And then the other lovely moment is when the John Knightley children are in the carriage and it's raining and they trace they're racing raindrops down the window of the coach. And I think only somebody who's really interested in children would see that detail, because Jane Austen is interested in children and she sees them, but also she doesn't really like spoiled children, does she? What does she say? I'd love to give that child a wholesome thump. And that is still one of my favourite quotes. And I'm like, many a time I said to my 3 children, you're going to get a wholesome thump if you're not careful. And Jane Austen said that's okay, so I will give you a wholesome thump.
It's a literary wholesome thump. None of your common
children. Why
ones.
was I saying children? Oh, the filigree basket. But so Lady Middleton, she is so obsessed with her children. They're so horrible. And Lucy's trying to ingratiate herself with Lady Middleton. So she's making this filigree basket. And then Eleanor sort of offers to help her. And there's a world going on there in that moment. Just like when Edward, before he proposes to Eleanor and he's so overcome, he takes up a pair of scissors and he starts cutting fabric. He cuts really random way. Like
the scissor sheath.
He just stops.
Just like, yeah.
It's just, and it's just a brilliant metaphor. You know, we know how he feels just by, I'm just going to pick up these random scissors and just cut something. And she's sort of looking at him saying, is this a proposal? What is really
Are you just
going on
ruining
here?
my stuff? Like,
do you know that? Remember that moment?
Yeah.
So let's just talk about the flannel waistcoat, just for 2 seconds, because we talk about the flannel. Hilary and I just sit there talking about Jane Austen all the time, even when we shouldn't be. We're like, so I know you told me about his flannel waistcoat, but please tell everybody.
All right,
again.
I'm going to have to... I'm about to make true confessions time here. All right. So I really like late Georgian flannel underwear. And I had a dream the other day that I was kind of, because I'm the chair of a master's degree, so lots of my students, they all have to do a thesis project. And in my dream, I was in some sort of situation where I got to do a thesis project. And in an unlikely fashion, this wasn't something that was like a burden or obligation. It was like, yay, I get to write a thesis. And my dream brain was going, what would I write a thesis on if I was going to do it now? And my dream brain went, late Georgian flannel underwear. And it started organizing the article that I wanted to write on this. And I woke up going, I think I better start my article on late Georgian flannel underwear. So I did. So Paula, I can tell you like so much about, I could just talk the rest of the evening about Colonel Brandon's flannel waistcoat.
Okay, but it's not sexy, Hilary, is it? Can we just get that? So is it sexy?
Well.
Because Marianne says, you know, she can't get excited about a man who wears a flannel waistcoat.
This is, okay, for me, actually, the flannel waistcoat is it's one of those Austen multi-layered genius moments. Because, all right, we all settled in? Are we ready to hear about flannel waistcoats? All right, so yes, Marianne absolutely says, you know, but for me it conjures up rheumatism and all sorts of aches and pains of old age. And it absolutely does. So a flannel waistcoat, I showed one in my talk, wool goes next to the skin or over your shirt, and it is worn in sickness. There's a moment in the letters where Austen talks about my uncle is still in his flannels, he's getting better again. So it's a fabric of warmth and softness and, you know, sort of think about like, you know, things we wear in Jersey, like sweatsuits now. So yes, it absolutely is a sign of age or infirmity, but it's also a military garment. And if you look at military advice manuals throughout the late 18th and early 19th century, they are full of flannels. And if you're going to the tropics, you take flannels because they're going to stop the insensible perspiration and regulate your temperature and stop you falling ill. Are you going to sea? Take flannels because wool holds warmth when it's wet. It'll keep you safe. Are you going to the Indies? Take flannels just in case. And Colonel Brandon was stationed in the East Indies. When he comes back to England, he's colder. He's wearing flannel waistcoats as a sign of his military service in an area that means he's kind of temperature regulating. But there's a third meaning because, of course, Austen, you know, third meaning. And it's in as far back as Lord Chesterfield's advice to his son that an old man would do better to wear a flannel waistcoat than to take a young wife to his bosom. So she's making a cultural reference to the perception of age difference between Brandon and Marianne, which in Austen fashion, you know, it's both ironic and non-ironic because he is going to take that young wife to his bosom and he's only 35. You know, he's 35, 17. So
that's brilliant, Hilary. Your link is brilliant. That is brilliant.
It's a triple meaning in that one, in Marianne's dismissal, for people at the time, there are all of these echoes that tell you exactly what their relationship is, what Colonel Brandon did, and how she perceives him and foreshadows their future relationship.
And there's also the context because as she's saying that, she's just before then she said, of all costumes, Willoughby's hunting jacket is the best. So the context there is Willoughby's got this gorgeous hunting jacket or riding jacket. It's one or the other. And then you get the flannel waistcoat.
But
so
it's
again,
also...
she's drawing our attention to how clothes, they are costumes.
And Willoughby, she's attracted to what Willoughby has on the outside, and she's dismissing what Colonel Brandon has on the inside. And that's going to flip around by the end of it. That Willoughby's seeming is what's attractive to her, but the solid, plain, dependable warmth that Colonel Brandon has next to his skin, that's what she's going to end up with.
The other object I found, though, which was one of my objects, was the card of lace. Because do you remember Jane Austen's other aunt stole a card of lace?
And if she'd been accused, she would have been sent to New South Wales.
You probably would have been an ancestor.
Exactly. She could have been my great-great-granny.
But and that was because a card of lace was over £1, so it was a very valuable item. And you know the story, don't you, that she pocketed it and was apprehended. And you know that her own doctor said she was a kleptomaniac and that she stole a plant. She stole a plant from a garden centre many years later. So she was getting some thrill from stealing because she didn't need to. She was rich. That's always fascinated me. And then, of course, Cassandra Austen saying, shall I send Jane and Cassandra to prison to keep you company? And you imagine Jane Austen in prison with her aunt,
who she didn't much like,
who she didn't really like very much.
So yeah.
So objects do. I mean, that's just another example to me of how, again, the quotidian, a card of lace, it doesn't seem very big, but in fact, that can change your whole life. Well, she could have been transported.
On the First Fleet, which is the first range of ships that took convicted transportees to the colony of New South Wales, which will become Australia, but doesn't really become so till about 1817. I know you care. It's when you look at what people were convicted for, 40% of them were sent to Australia for stealing an item of clothing, and it could be a handkerchief, lots of small portable things, a watch, a handkerchief, sometimes a length of fabric, but that was enough to that's it. You're gone to the other side of the world and you're not coming back.
That's so shocking, isn't it?
And, if you guys hadn't become independent, they wouldn't have had to settle Australia. So thanks.
Yeah, it's all your fault.
Been a much quicker trip if you hadn't, gone all independent.
John.
So the question is from John, with fabulously encyclopedic rundown about the difference between Austen's pleasure and interest in fashion in her letters and the way that she uses clothing in the novels, where anybody who is actively interested in clothing is sort of there's a suspicion about their character. They're frivolous, they're vain, they're immoral, and there's a sort of direct connection between active interest in fashion and sort of weak character. Would that be a good summary? Just they're silly. And so this is really partaking of a lot of the conventions about what fashion is supposed to do in Austen's time. And there's a long-standing idea of there's an image of fashion as a tyrant, and fashion is something that's going to swoop down and get you. And if you are too interested in fashion and in the vanities and the superficialities, you will be swept away by it. And especially for the middle classes, they're caught in this tension between having to know enough about what is in fashion to be seemly and appropriate, but not too fashionable so that you might look vulgar or French. Whoops. But then also not being out of fashion so that you are, dowdy or not looking like you're holding your position in society. So it was kind of like quite a narrow Goldilocks zone, to use the planetary metaphor. But it is true that if Austen mentions clothing in the books, it's because she's making you pay attention to an aspect of that person's character. And the people who talk about the clothing the most, the way they talk about it tells you about their character, usually in a negative way. So that is kind of holding to a lot of the conventions about what fashion should be doing and the amount of attention that someone should pay to fashion, which people negotiate in all sorts of ways. Mariah Edgeworth has fantastic examples of relating conversations about fashion that, someone says, well, how often do you dress when you go to the country? And someone says, oh, twice a day. And someone says, no, you must think about it seriously, changing 4 times a day. And it is kind of used to show a kind of a silliness or a triviality in character, but what people felt about it in their personal lives seems to be different as well. And Austen is almost like towing the cultural party line by her use of fashion within the novels a little bit.
I don't agree with you, actually. Because I don't think that is true. Well, it's sort of true, but it's not altogether true, because there are 2 moments that I think where it becomes really important. And there's one moment when Fanny, they're all sitting by in Southerton Court, and Henry and Maria are going off beyond into the wilderness, and Fanny says, "Be careful, you might tear your gown on the spikes." And it's a deeply symbolic moment which foreshadows the adultery, the spike being a phallic symbol, and you'll tear your gown, and that foreshadows the adultery. So I think that's not frivolous. And I think the other moment that's not frivolous is when Lydia, who's been living with Wickham, doing all sorts of stuff in London, and then she comes back and she shouts out, her maid must mend the slit in my gown. I'm sorry, if that's not a vagina, then I don't know what it is. Because nothing's really frivolous with Jane Austen. And I think there are 2 moments that are actually deeply symbolic, and she doesn't really go for symbolism. So when we have these symbolic moments in dress, I think that's really critical.
But I think that's what I mean. She wants you to pay attention. And there are also moments where, like, Lizzie Bennet is working on a bonnet, and there's moments where the heroines are sort of doing needlework, but again, the quality of the needlework is what's important. So Lady Bertram, who spends a whole lot of time doing carpet work of no value and no taste, that even she can't even get through that without Fanny's help. But then Fanny is supposed to be working on, Mrs. Norris is very clear to call attention that there's work in the poor box that Fanny could be doing, which is kind of good, virtuous, moral making of clothing to give to the poor. So again, it's like if Austen mentions clothing, she wants to tell us something, because there's so little description in it. And what's interesting to me as well is... and
even Elizabeth's dirty petticoat is important.
Exactly.
Because she's running in the rain to see her sister.
And she's hoiked up the outer.
The Miss Bingleys are being really snobby. I mean, I think that's really important, that they're looking down on her dress. And, look how dirty it is. And then Mr. Darcy's like, oh, well, her complexion's all lovely, and it shows how much she loves her sister. So I feel like nothing really is frivolous, really. I think even that dirty petticoat reveals a lot about who Elizabeth is.
And what I find interesting too is that Northanger Abbey is the clothesiest of Austen's novels. And not just in things like Mrs. Allen or Isabella Thorpe, but we get more detail of the men's clothing about, greatcoats and things like that. And I wonder if she'd had more time working on Northanger Abbey, if those would have been erased. Because, thinking about like Lady Susan and the kind of we heard the sort of the wit and wickedness and panache of Lady Susan. I feel like in the later works, there's a lot like she writes and then she takes away and takes away and takes away. And I wonder if Northanger Abbey would have lost a lot of its clothing if she'd had more time to work on it and kind of leave only the moments that she feels most tell us what it is that she needs to, and she's removing everything else that doesn't do exactly what she wants it to. But that's just that's my feeling. But I think it's interesting that the earliest finished is also the most clothy. The most clothy.
Oh, I love that. Mr. Rushworth's pink satin cloak is just
exactly.
It's so delicious. I know that's a theatrical costume, but I just love the detail of his 42 speeches and his satin cloak. Again, it's just, she has such fun with it, doesn't she? It's brilliant.
Mrs. Elton being this is one I love, Mrs. Elton being as elegant as pearls and lace can make her. Burn.
Yeah, love it. Sorry, there was a question from...
So the question is about how Henry Tilney's knowledge of muslin fits into this idea. He's pulling her leg. He's kind of, he's making conversation and slightly making fun of her and pulling her leg at the same time. But I think he also probably, of all Austen's heroes, I think he is the one who would know about muslin. Like he might be kind of making.
He's more
fun
effeminate,
of it,
isn't he, than the others? He's definitely more
kind
effeminate.
of alert to small things. And also, just to go back to the spices, this is something else that I really love this detail. So he's talking about the difference. He's talking about a true Indian muslin, and it being a bargain. And if he could get it for 4 shillings at that point, it really was a bargain. But I found these recipes in a couple of books for making your muslin smell like true Indian muslin by packing it into a basket with spices. And then I found some other references for British muslin manufacturers sending it back to India and then having it repacked and sent from India. And it's because it's packed into the hold with all of those spices that it picks up a certain smell. And so I was thinking as well about, like, could you smell an Indian muslin? Is Henry Tilney, if he does have this ability, is it not just about that material quality, but is there like this exotic fragrance, which is how it's described in this recipe book, to give it an exotic fragrance. So if you want Indian muslin, you basically pack things up in a basket, in a cupboard with spices for 6 months, and it will be like the genuine article.
I love that. And also I wanted to ask you, Hilary, because clothes denote behaviour in Jane Austen. So I was always fascinated in Mansfield Park by a moment when Tom Bertram gets very confused about who's out and who's not out. And it's a Miss Snide that he meets, I think, at Ramsgate, I can't remember. And he mistakes the sister because one has a closed bonnet and one, do you remember this? And one has an open bonnet. And the closed bonnet is the girl who's not out and the open bonnet is the girl who's out. And one of the girls is behaving in a very brash way. So Tom Bertram thinks, oh, she must be out. So he starts flirting with the girl with the open bonnet. And then he discovers he's really slighted the sister who is the older sister. He shouldn't have flirted with the younger sister. So I think she's still always got that sensitivity of how clothes denote conduct. It's never frivolous. I feel like that's a really important moment. And he says, I got into trouble. I got the wrong sister. Do you remember that moment?
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about closed and open bonnets?
It's a very, those nuances of who's out. I looked into that for the first book and I couldn't find more information about it, which I think is actually a really interesting data point, because one of the things that I'm really interested in doing when looking at Regency clothing is trying to sort of get at how people at the time perceived it. If they're looking at clothing, how do they know if that's French or in the French style? How can you see that in these small details? And it's something like that about the way you might wear it. I mean, there's things about putting your hair up. You're obviously grown up and out. So, the half up, hair down in screen adaptations does my head in. But it's actually really hard to kind of capture some of those nuances.
But when he says that, he must have he gets it wrong and he's in trouble because he's got the wrong girl.
And because
so
it's
he
Austen,
must, and
we know that
would matter.
Yeah.
And remember William Price when he says, he reaches out his hand to Fanny and he says, oh, that queer fashion on your hair. And I love the fact that he's in the Navy. And I'm always interested how the Navy also affects fashion after the Battle of the Nile.
He says, I first saw it in Gibraltar.
Yes, he says, I first saw it in Gibraltar. So that fashion has come. And he just reaches his hand out to Fanny's head and says, oh, that queer fashion, it's come, And I love that he notices.
Yeah.
It's just a lovely little moment that William Price notices his sister has this fashionable hairstyle that he's also seen in Gibraltar.
Which, of course, brings us to, probably the least frivolous use of clothing or dress in Austen, which is the topaz cross. And that in complete crossover between the, gesture between siblings and the gesture of fraternal love that is in an Austen's life that seems to be reflected in fiction between William and Fanny Price, and this incredibly beautiful expression of
it's just a gorgeous moment, that, isn't it? And there's two chains, and again, she doesn't really do symbolism a lot, does she? But when she does, we sort of sit back, and Henry gives her the chain surreptitiously via Mary, and the chain doesn't fit, and then Edmund gives her a simple gold chain, and you can tell something about Jane Austen's taste, I think, in that Fanny doesn't want the rather gaudy chain. She's so relieved that Edmund's chain fits her topaz cross, and I think the sentence says something like, to unite the two people she loved most in the world. It's deeply beautiful and symbolic, and I was always very moved by Fanny's schoolroom. She sort of gets she goes into the East Room.
You write about that so beautifully.
The schoolroom hasn't changed, and on the windows, on the mantelpiece, is a picture that William sent Fanny with this mast that's so high, and it always moved me to tears. It's just William being a midshipman, and it's all wrong, the perspective, but he sent it to Fanny, and she has so little that this is one of her most precious items, which is just HMS Antwerp, isn't it? Do you remember? And it's sort of all skew-whiff, and it's all a bit out of kilter, and it's the perspective wrong. And to me, it's just a deeply symbolic moment. And then, of course, when Sir Thomas lights the fire in that room, even though he's so angry with her for not marrying Henry Crawford, he still lights the fire to keep her warm because she's so cold. And there's nothing in that room. There's a faded footstool, badly worked over by Julia, remember?
It's all the things that other people don't want.
Nobody wants.
Including
and Fanny's just the repository of stuff that nobody really cares about, except, I think, HMS Antwerp and the family silhouette.
Yeah, it's really, and I mean, you're thinking as well about in Mansfield Park as well. There's all the pride and joy of William's new uniform as a midshipman, and this kind of complete sartorial transformation into this new position and into this new life, and how exciting for him as well to have a completely new sets of clothes, and the kind of the freshness being worn off because of when he is allowed and isn't allowed to wear them, but that kind of like the pride of showing off this newly embodied growing young man.
Oh, that's a lovely moment. And then there's Betsy's knife, talking about stuff. Do you remember the siblings of Fanny? So Betsy and Susan fight over this paper knife. And I think I'm right in thinking that Fanny, she's just like, what is going on? These kids are having this fight. And I think she just buys another knife or something. So she does something, doesn't she, to sort it out. And it's almost like Fanny then becomes the giver of things. So Fanny's always been receiving stuff nobody wants. But I think part of her growth and her emotional growth is, I can not just be the beneficiary of Mansfield Park, but I can give to others. I can take Susan to the circulating library. But I can give another knife to solve. So I think it's a really subtle, but really, really beautiful moment when she becomes a giver as opposed to someone who takes.
And also giving something that she knows somebody wants. Because as someone who's received things that people want to give her without kind of thinking about whether she likes it or not, she can give her sister something that she knows her sister wants, which is also a pleasure in agency and choice, perhaps, that she's facilitating.
And then Edmund giving her pen and paper. It's the first thing anybody gives her at Mansfield Park when she's crying on the stairs. And he says, cousin, why are you crying? And she just wants to write to William. And he says, it's so easy. And then she says, we'll frank the letter. And she's like, oh, how do we frank the letter? And she's absolutely freaked out. But the gift of pen and paper and communication, I think they're very small moments. And I do think Jane Austen forces us to pay attention because these things are sort of deeply, deeply important. She's given us clues all the time. So I think we do well to pay attention to small things.
And it's also, I mean, think about the materiality of a letter. You know, we're so used to encountering them as the content and what Jane and Cassandra are writing to each other about. But just think about as Catherine Sutherland has looked at so beautifully, the actual materiality of the letters and the way that they're often double crossed, and trying to get as much into this little thing, this small thing that transmits so much emotion and information and family connection, and does such a job of cementing and circulating family feeling, and all of the kind of the sealing wax and the quality of the paper and the way that it's been handled by all these people getting between the family. Like the thing of a letter is something that we sometimes again forget for the content of the letter.
Should we do one more thing and then wrap
and
it
then
up?
then we'll let you go and dance.
Just to follow from that, I was so thrilled to go back to Chawton Cottage this recently and to see the carved letter case that Frank made for Jane Austen, which I've never seen before. And I think he made 2. And I think am I right in thinking they're quite recent acquisitions? The family have only just lent them to the House Museum, and it's the most beautiful cart, because we know he carved, and he is very like Harville, isn't he, with making toys and carving things and making fishing nets, things, stuff, children's toys. And Frank said in that letter to an American woman years later, I like to think Captain Harville's a bit like me because he fashions toys, and he made a little sort of butter churn, didn't he, for Fanny Knight, and he made nets, and he was a great sewer, because you have to sew when you sew when you're on board a ship. But the letter case I'd never seen before. And it's so moving. You know, it's just the most beautiful. It's got J.A. He carved her initials. Has anyone seen it? No. I honestly think it's new, because I was like, oh, is that the letter case? And because I'd read about it recently, and I think they said, oh, the family have only just allowed us to show it, just I think for this year. But it's another thing, and I'd love to have written about that for My Life in Small Things, the letter case, because I mean, you just take an object and you can do so much with that. But I think you can Google it and you'll see it. But it's quite slender, because I was thinking, how many letters can you get? I was imagining it almost to be like a box, but it's not. It's a case. You know, it's a slender case for her letters. And to me, that again, the power of a brother's love. Her letters were so important. I think we always blame Cassandra for destroying all the letters, but Frank's granddaughter destroyed all of her letters. And I'm like, hang on a minute. Like, we're always having a go at Cassandra. I'm like, he cherished. And also, how difficult is it to keep letters that are water-stained, at risk of fire, at risk of war?
Mice.
And he treasured all of those hundreds of letters that Jane Austen wrote, and he made her a letter case. And he preserves them, and his flipping granddaughter or grandniece or somebody thinks in a good, I'll just burn those. I always think we don't tell that story enough. So that's my final object.
And your final objection.
My final objection.
Thank you very much. I think we've definitely run out of time, but thank you so much
everybody.
for coming.
Dearest listeners, I am pleased to announce that Austen Chat now has over 200 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for your support. If you haven't yet given us a rating, please consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts so that more Janeites can find us and join our Austen-loving community. Again, thank you. I remain yours respectfully, Breckenwood.